Nun habe ich die ganz große Ehre, einen Veteran der internationalen Games-Industrie Ihnen vorstellen zu dürfen, der uns einen Impulsvortrag geben wird und dann auch das nächste Panel moderiert. Noah Falstein hat für LucasArts und für DreamWorks unter anderem gearbeitet. Zu den von ihm entworfenen oder mitentworfenen Titeln gehören Klassiker wie Sinister oder Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. 4 Jahre lang war er Chief Game Designer bei Google und hat dort Spiele entworfen für die VR- und AR-Anwendungen von Google, bevor er das Unternehmen dann verließ und sich vollkommen den Themen Gesundheit und Spiele verschrieben hat. Zu den also das macht er bis heute auch noch und ist da sehr, sehr aktiv in diesem Bereich. Eins seiner bemerkenswertesten Projekte ist sicherlich Remission. Das ist ein Spiel von einer Stiftung in den USA, das jugendlichen Krebspatienten hilft, die Chemotherapie besser durchzustehen. Und das ist ein großartiges Projekt und ich bin ganz froh, dass er jetzt heute hier ist. Normalerweise hätten wir uns im Sommer auf der Gamescom gesehen. Noah, happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay. I'm having a little trouble hearing the audio there, but am I ready to go now?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Noah Falstein. I'm president of the Inspiracy, my consulting company. And today I'll be giving a short talk about how games are helping with health and well-being in that particular sustainable development goal. And in particular, I'll be talking just about some of the definitions and generalities so that we can get into some of the specifics in our panel coming up soon. But I'll give you a few concrete examples as well. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers for letting me participate remotely like this. In happier times, I'd be eager to come out to Germany, but we make do as best we can. Just to give you a sense of my trajectory, going from fabrics into games may seem like a bit of a large step here, but games are really changing and have been changing ever since they've been around. I started making games professionally in 1980 and have worked on everything from arcade games to companies doing boxed games. But starting about 25 years ago, I primarily became a freelance game designer and started to realize that there are more and more opportunities for being able to use games for actually health and all sorts of wellness activities. The first one of those that you see pictured was Remission, that was helping teenagers with cancer stick to their treatment regimens. And I started to do a lot of work in that area, but got sidetracked by an offer to come to Google and worked for Google for 4 years. And that was a wonderful experience. I particularly learned quite a bit about VR and AR and thinking globally and thinking about how to reach billions of people at a time. But I really loved the idea of working on games for health. And for the last 3 years, I've gone back full time to working with a variety of clients on those sorts of things. And I'll be talking about some of those as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with some definitions here. The first one is talking about different ways that games are actually helpful, because when I talk about games helping with healthcare, it may seem puzzling at first. One of the most obvious ways that they've been doing it for some time is through education. And in that sense, I'm talking about education for the public, for people that, for example, might use a game, a child who might use a game to learn about good nutrition or better health habits, or how to, for example, crave smoking less, or some of the other bad habits for health. Training, we're going to hear a little bit more about today, because there are several companies that are doing excellent work in training caregivers at all levels, from the technicians that work in hospitals, to the caregivers in a home for the aging, to doctors and physicians who are actually learning how to be better surgeons or to treat diseases directly. Games have also been used for research for quite some time. There have been some high-profile citizen science games that have helped research things like protein folding or the structure of DNA. One of the most interesting areas that I'll be talking about is how games are now being used directly as treatment and are literally being prescribed by doctors at this point to treat disorders and diseases. And finally, an emerging area that I think we'll see a lot more of is games as a diagnostic process. So simply by playing your game, perhaps on your Nintendo or on your phone, the game may itself be able to diagnose diseases, particularly things like incipient Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or some other degenerative diseases, sometimes as much as 5 or 10 years before other methods are able to do that. Next line, please. So also to break it down, there are three general ways I think that games are being used. Sometimes it's just the game technology, and I'll be talking about that as it relates, for example, to telehealth. One step deeper in is it's what's come to be called gamification, where some of the techniques of games and game design and game production are used to amplify the effectiveness of other areas. And then finally, what is generally called serious games, where the games themselves have a purpose beyond entertainment. And that's where things like the treatment and diagnosis and research come in that I mentioned. Next line, please. Next, please. Okay, so there are three general areas where digital technology and games are helping with healthcare. The sort of lightest area that uses all of the categories I've mentioned above is digital health, where you're doing something that is promoting well-being, for example, but doesn't really require evidence, merely, for example, something that educates children about good nutrition, for example, doesn't necessarily have to show that it's actually changing people's lives by doing that, simply passing on information that has been verified as valid. Next line, please. Beyond that, we have something called digital medicine, medicine, where there's some clinical evidence that the digital software, the game, as it were, has some actual effect on the patients. And this brings us to a level of, there are a number of games out there that use meditation or relaxation techniques to relieve anxiety. And those have been verified to, for example, change people's heart rate or change their EEG in real time as they play these games in beneficial ways. And finally, the next line, please. Digital therapeutics are the current highest level, where there's not only clinical evidence with randomized controls trials that often have hundreds of people and experiments with very large groups and using double-blind techniques as well. But they also have real-world outcomes so that you can see that these are actually having a direct impact on people's lives. And that's the highest level because it often takes years and millions, often tens of millions of dollars or euros to be able to make these sorts of changes. Next slide, please. So what does this have to do with the Sustainable Development Goal of health and well-being? Well, I'm going to let our panelists talk about some of the specifics, but I'll give you an overview of some of the things that I've seen firsthand that I think are really useful about what games can do. Next, please. So first, I should mention that games are already tackling the COVID-19 epidemic in a number of ways. I've actually given an entire talk on that, so I won't go into the full details here. There are literally dozens of companies trying different things to either do diagnosis or treatment or tracking of people who have caught it, all through either techniques or technology that has been learned from the games industry. Next line, please. Also, game technology and play have a lot of uses for these health goals, and I'll be getting into that specifically. Next slide, please. So here are 5 examples, and I'll go through these quickly. I want to make sure we stay on time here. So the first one is actually an old one because I wanted to point out that this has been around for some time, that back in 2005, I actually had an experience of learning about a game called Safety Cricket that had been made in India. And this is pre-smartphone, of course, when they were feature phones without a lot of power. But they already had 60 million downloads in India on this cricket game that taught children about safe sex. Some very simple fundamentals. It wasn't very heavily integrated into the gameplay, but I was very impressed that they could get 60 million users even back in 2005. Now, of course, we're up to 3.5 billion smartphones being used in the world, and that number is only increasing over time. So in terms of sustainable development, since smartphones are in the hands of so many people, and as a technology, it has a smaller footprint than larger computers, I think we're going to be seeing quite a bit more. Individual apps are routinely now being able to get as many as 1 billion users, and we have games that are approaching that number as well. Next slide, please. One of the really important things, and the reasons that I think that games are very useful here for these sustainable goals, is that they're essentially learning engines. That if you've ever played a game, you've probably noticed that the point where you stop wanting to play it is when there's nothing new to learn. You've conquered all the levels, or you've explored all the areas, or you've reached the peak of what you can do with your skill set. And games are really fine-tuned to teach through interaction, which research has shown is the most durable way that we really learn things and get these lessons really integrated into our minds and our bodies. What I'm showing here is a slide from a project called Play Forward that Yale University is doing. And this is to help disadvantaged preteens and teens in the New Haven, Connecticut area learn about how to avoid risky behavior. They're doing a long-term study to see whether players of this game, young women, actually have lower unwanted pregnancy rates as teenagers, simply compared to a group that only plays a placebo game that doesn't have anything to do about risky behavior. Next slide, please. One of the areas where game technology and game developers are being used to make something that are not games is in telehealth. And in terms of sustainable development and reaching the developing world in large numbers, we've seen that we need things that are common to video games, and that video games have often either promoted in the world or helped develop the technology to do, and often have the best engineers who are familiar with it, like high quality internet connection, a use of virtual and augmented reality, which is another thing that is worthy of an entire talk, and very low latency. Low latency is really important for a lot of gameplay. It's also quite critical for good telehealth, and particularly if a doctor is going to be interacting closely with a patient. Next slide, please. And digital therapeutics, I've mentioned, I find this quite exciting. I've been working with a company called Akili Interactive, and just a few months ago, they were cleared by the FDA and also received their CE mark in Europe around the same time. And what's exciting about that is that this is the first game that has been on its own cleared to treat a major disease or disorder. Specifically, in this case, it treats pediatric ADHD. And doctors are just in the last few weeks beginning to prescribe playing this game for a required amount of time, on the same way that they would prescribe Adderall or Ritalin to treat ADHD, but with side effects that are much milder. The worst side effects that were coming up in this test were occasional headaches and frustration. So it's really exciting to see that this is taking off, and there are lots of other diseases and disorders that we believe can be treated in this way, particularly when they're neurological in their nature. And next slide, please. So finally, this is also becoming in a course of serious investments and financial movement in the world. There are acquisitions. We have the CEO of Level X with us, a company that was recently acquired by the German company BrainLab. There are billions of dollars in funding each year in digital health in general. The majority of that, of course, is not going to games, but the games share is growing extremely quickly. And a lot of what games are doing, I think, are particularly relevant to sustainable development goals. But what I think is really important to note here is that this has global impact. There are developers in virtually every country in the world who are working on these sorts of projects. And it really impacts all regions. And it's very exciting as to what that can do. So I've given you an overview here. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is my contact information. I know this has been rather brief, but if anybody wants more detail on what you've seen or want to correspond with me about this, I'm really passionate about this. One of the things I love about using games for health is that this area is very much like the entire games industry was 40 years ago, where we're all cooperating with each other to improve the quality of this in general. And I hope that that has been helpful to you, and looking forward to our panel coming up where we can give you a little more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noah, for this intro. We will have a little bit of music while we are preparing for the panel discussion that will be going on right after the music. That will be moderated by Noah as well. We will have within this session some live demos and reflection all around the sustainable development goal of number 3 of of games and of health and well-being. Sorry. Okay.
So you guys stay tuned, and Noah, stay tuned, please, and we'll be back in around 3 minutes' time.